Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to those of you watching on our live web stream as well. Yesterday, we heard Leslie, Ed Balls, Gillian Tett, all talking on essentially the same thing, diversity, or rather a lack of diversity, and how that lack of diversity conceals perspectives, protects implicit assumptions from challenge, impedes good decision-making. And as each of those speakers also said, we need to do something about that in each and every walk of life. Diversity is a cause in its own right, a cause I believe in strongly, and a cause which I'm immensely proud that the PLSA is championing at this conference and beyond. But it's also a vital aspect of another cause, one that takes in many of the other subjects we're discussing this week, good governance. Good governance matters. It's the foundation of success for pension schemes, just as it is for companies. It adds value, 1% of a fund's value each and every year, according to Keith Ambekshire. It means better long-term focus and better risk management. It means a better member experience with better, clearer communications. And it means less need, I believe, for regulators to intervene. And all of that means that improving pension scheme governance can increase confidence in our sector, the confidence we need to earn from each and every saver. And it can help those savers achieve a better income in retirement, because that's why we're here. And at the PLSA, and previously the NAPF, we've been talking about good governance for a while now. In the 1980s, Donald Brydon pioneered this association's work on corporate governance. In 2005, Joanne Seegers wrote a paper on how to take trustee governance into the 21st century, the conclusions of which are now looking more than a decade overdue, I have to say. And in our manifesto for the 2015 election, Pensions Possibilities, we described how we needed to redraw the boundaries of regulation, the need to focus not on using checklists and codes to regulate what trustees do, but instead on making sure we have the right people with the right skills acting as trustees in the first place. We said the pensions regulator should set and monitor challenging new criteria for trustee boards, challenging in terms of the expertise held collectively by the board, challenging in terms of the commitment of each individual trustee to act in the member interest. And we said that where a trustee board meets those high standards, where it's ready to deliver great governance, it should be allowed to get on and do so. And that remains our view. So what might those high standards be? What areas should we focus on? Well, first, clearly, we need those traditional skills. We need trustee boards made up of individuals who understand benefits, investment, communication, and regulation, of course. But we also need a broader set of skills which recognise the reality of running a pension scheme in the 21st century. We need commercial nous, the ability to negotiate, the ability to gather and use insight about members, the ability to hold advisors and suppliers to account. This is all about inputs, the individual and collective expertise which trustees bring to the table. And it's also about the perspectives they bring to the table. Diverse perspectives developed through their background, heritage, skills, identity, and their personal and professional experience. Now, these diverse perspectives need unity too. They need to understand and be aligned with each other, with the position of the employer and with the needs and expectations of scheme members, all of which depends on good working relationships, both within governance bodies and between governance bodies and others. And critically, it depends on leadership. The role of the chair is vital. The chair has to stand outside the rest of the board as a guide, but also draw on the strength of the board to provide the direction of that guidance and to shape difference into consensus. Now, when you have this cohesive whole of complementary skills and perspectives, you need to use it, which means appropriate resourcing, time commitment, capability and focus on the right issues. And finally, we need to make sure it works and keeps working. Conflicts of interest, which are inevitable in our interconnected industry, need to be disclosed and handled. Decisions need to be transparent, and those making those decisions need to be held accountable. We think there is a lot we can learn from corporate governance when we think about how we might make this happen. Greg Clark has said the UK's high corporate governance standards give people around the world confidence in the UK as a place to do business. I think he's right. But of course, corporate governance wasn't always as good as it is now. It didn't always inspire confidence in the UK as a place to do business. And as is so often the case, it took a scandal, in fact, a series of scandals, to build the robust system we have today. Polypec International, BCCI, Robert Maxwell, of course, a series of high-profile failures in UK corporate governance in the late 80s and early 90s, which led to the creation of the Cadbury Committee in 1991. The committee which in 1992 produced the first corporate governance code. Now let's be clear, that code hasn't been a panacea, and there remains plenty for us at the PLSA to do in monitoring the application of the code and upholding investors' interests. But the code has set a standard of governance that is now the foundation for corporate governance elsewhere, in the European Union, the United States, the World Bank. It sets clear standards for leadership, effectiveness, and accountability. And much of good corporate governance is about making sure the right people are appointed to the job in the first place. People with the right skills, experience, independence, and knowledge. And then making sure they report transparently on what it is they get up to. Those feel like the right places to put the emphasis, not on telling them specifically what to do. It's not a checklist, it's about inputs and the outcomes they can produce, not about processes. And I think that's the approach we need for pensions. We need equally high standards for pension governance to give everyone in the UK confidence in their pensions as the place to save. Now, of course, the pensions regulator continues to make good progress with the way trustees are regulated. We have frequently quoted the number of demands the DC Code made of trustees, for example, and the new DC Code is indeed more flexible. But it still sits alongside 12 other TPR codes of practice, underpinned by 7 pieces of code-related guidance and with links to 21 pieces of regulatory guidance. Compare that with the Corporate Governance Code. It's clear, it's systematic, it's high profile, and it's the 37-page single source of good practice. None of which is to say that the regulator's multiple codes don't help, because they do. The Trustee Knowledge and Understanding Code of Practice, for example, has undoubtedly raised standards since its introduction in 2009. But yet, 50% of schemes with non-professional trustees, surveyed by TPR in 2015, said some of those trustees simply didn't possess a level of understanding that met those standards. And let's compare that situation with corporate governance again. The Financial Reporting Council's recent research found that over 90% of UK companies are compliant with all but 1 or 2 minor provisions of the Corporate Governance Code. In some ways, perhaps that difference is understandable. Years of over-regulation, complexity, fragmentation, constant changes in the market have made doing the job of a trustee more and more difficult each year, year after year. And the scale and the access to resources I spoke about earlier is a dream for many trustee boards. There are 33,000 trust-based DC pension schemes with fewer than 12 members, and a further 1,500 with fewer than 100 members. We tend to call them institutional investors, but in practice, most of them have the expertise and the approach of retail investors. They are unlikely to have the expertise to question or challenge their asset managers, and they are unlikely to have advisors to help them do that vital job. And if they do have advisors, well, they're unlikely to have the expertise to question or challenge them effectively. And I'm sure you'll hear more on that particular topic from Christopher Woolard in our next session. On the DB side, we also have a large number of small schemes. The average scheme has just 1,800 members and just £200 million of assets under management. And in today's environment, frankly, they're struggling. And because they're struggling, their members are struggling too, facing a material risk of not seeing the benefits they expect. You heard all about that this morning from Ashok and the panel talking about our DB task force work. And you also heard, I hope, our DB task force's single-minded focus on consolidating, not for consolidation's sake, but because it can produce much higher standards of governance. Now, when we stand up to talk to you about an issue, we like to find out what you think about it first. And the pre-conference survey results often appear in this part of the conference. Well, this year is no exception. So last month, we asked trustees about why they're involved in pension scheme governance, how they and their boards approach governance, and where they feel they need to improve skills and diversity on their trustee boards. There were some interesting results. It's really great to see such a committed group of people, people who want to make sure members receive their benefits in financially sound schemes. And more than half are looking to improve their scheme's governance. More than half also want to develop their own skills. And encouragingly, 59% could not think of anything that impacts negatively on their trustee board's performance. But when we look at diversity, the theme of this conference, of course, then there is less to be encouraged by. Yes, 80% feel there are diverse professional qualifications on their boards. But fewer, 61%, think their boards have diverse levels of education. So perhaps there are PMI, qualified pensions professionals, lawyers, actuaries, investment professionals maybe, but perhaps fewer of the people who might bring a more diverse range of skills to the table. And as we get deeper into diversity, we find that only 53% feel their board has a diverse age range. Only 49% think their board has good gender diversity, and only 28% thought their board was diverse in terms of ethnicity. Lacking in diversity in trustees' own self-assessment. But that doesn't mean the people doing the job aren't individually the right people. What it means is that collectively there are some perspectives and some skill sets that trustee boards simply aren't benefiting from in sufficient numbers right now. And there are other clear areas, I think, where we can improve governance. A fifth of trustees who responded told us that their schemes don't evaluate their board at all. 2/3 do, but frankly, we don't think that's enough. And 3/4 of schemes that do evaluate their boards keep the results to themselves and don't publish them or share them with anybody else. So perhaps what that survey tells me is we are very, very committed to providing good pensions, but through a lack of diversity, we're systematically excluding perspectives. And by and large, we're not being sufficiently transparent about how effective we're being as a board responsible for that pension scheme. So what might some of the answers be? Well, you heard plenty about diversity yesterday, and you'll hear more about it tomorrow. And you'll see much more from this association well beyond this conference. For now, there are two other areas I'd like to focus on. The first is consolidation. There is huge strength in trust-based pension fund governance. And across the industry, we clearly have the people, the skills, and the leadership we need. But too often, it's too fragmented. There's insufficient sharing of skills and expertise. We don't realise the full potential of our model. So as we've concluded in the work of the DB task force, we simply have to seek greater use of shared governance models. We simply have to create a culture and a mindset in which we think first about consolidated forms of governance. The second area is regulation. Now, I've talked about high standards, and the only people we should allow to govern pension funds should prove they have the skills to meet those standards through some new form of authorisation system. Of course, a system which has enough flexibility in it to make sure we can still draw on a diverse range of views. Having gone through that authorisation system, we believe that instead of regulating their activities, regulation should then focus on their performance and their results. A shift which maybe would force us to ask ourselves some difficult questions about exactly how we are held to account. Difficult questions which I think we have to ask and which we have to attempt to answer. Why, for example, don't we use Ofsted-style inspections of schemes to establish that they're really working as well as they should for the benefit of members? Why don't we redefine the reporting requirements placed on trustee boards? Why don't we bring them more into line with those placed on PLC boards? And why don't we take the results from those inspections and those board reports and use them to create benchmarks and league tables? Because after all, done right, there's nothing like a bit of competition to drive improvement. We're looking at these possibilities and others right now with a group of experts drawn from our councils and beyond. And next month, we will publish a paper exploring exactly how we can bring pension scheme governance up to speed. It will cover trustee experience and expertise across all relevant areas, including investment and stewardship, regulation, legal matters, and those commercial skills I talked about earlier. It will cover time commitments and dedication to improvement and upskilling on an individual trustee and collective board level. And it will cover plans for evaluation and improvement of the trustee board, including clear objectives across areas including member experience and funding position, and how these will be assessed. I want to talk to you about setting those standards, reporting and verifying them, and what should be done about dealing with failure to comply. Why? Because we've been through a period of rapid and far-reaching change in pensions and in the economy, and that isn't going to stop. The job of a trustee has been made ever more complex in the last 2 decades, and that's probably not going to stop either. So it's time to look at how we equip ourselves to do the best job we possibly can. And I look forward to working with all of you to improve the way we govern pension schemes in the future. Thank you.